In the summer of 1834, an American painter stood on the southern plains and watched a man on a horse do something he did not believe was physically possible. The rider was moving at a full gallop, not a canter, a flat-out run across open ground. And then he disappeared. The horse kept coming. Same speed, same line, no rider on its back, and hanging down the far side of it, invisible from the front, was a man holding his entire body weight on a single loop of hide slung across the horse's neck. One heel hooked into it, the rest of him suspended alongside the animal's ribs, using the horse itself as a moving wall. Then an arm came up under the horse's neck, and he was shooting at a full gallop from underneath a running animal with a bow accurately. Then he came back up, and he did it again on the other side. The painter, his name was George Catlin, and he had spent years travelling among native nations across the continent, wrote it down that evening. He said plainly that he had never seen horsemanship like it anywhere in his life, and he clearly knew nobody back east was going to believe him. Now Catlin noticed something else that day, and this is the part I want you to sit with. He said that on foot these men were not impressive. He described them as awkward, ungainly. He wrote that walking, they were about the least striking people he had come across. And then they got on a horse, and they became something else entirely. That contrast is not an insult, and it is not a coincidence. It is the whole story compressed into one sentence. Because these people had built their entire civilization on top of an animal, and off it they were half of what they were. They called themselves Numunu. It simply means the people. You know them by a name their enemies used. In the Ute language it meant something close to the ones who always want to fight us. Comanche. Now here is the fact that makes all of it strange. Go back 150 years from the moment Catlin is standing there with his mouth open. In the 1600s, the Comanche had never seen a horse. Nobody in North America had. The horse had gone extinct on this continent about 10,000 years earlier. The Spanish brought them back across the Atlantic, and then, in 1680, they lost control of them, and horses moved north through native trade networks faster than any European could follow. At that point, the Comanche were a small group in the mountains of what is now Wyoming, related to the Shoshone, travelling on foot, dragging their belongings behind dogs, no political weight, no reason for anyone in Madrid or Paris to have ever heard the name. Then, the horses reached them. Within about 50 years, they were the most formidable light cavalry on the continent, and European officers who had fought European wars wrote it down. 50 years. That is one lifetime. A man could be born into a people who walked everywhere and die among the finest riders on earth. Children were on horseback before they were properly walking, riding by 4 or 5. By adulthood, a Comanche man could lean from a running horse and lift a fallen companion off the ground without stopping. He could shoot arrows continuously, while a soldier with a muzzle-loading rifle was still ramming a single ball down the barrel. That soldier needed something like 20 seconds for one shot, and 20 seconds was a great many arrows. So now think about the picture in your head, because you have one, and you did not choose it. Wagons pulled into a circle, dust rising on a ridge, a line of riders appearing against the sky. That image did not come from a document. It came from a film studio, and it has been quietly standing in for the truth for about 100 years. Here is the real answer to the question in the title, and it is going to sound wrong. If you met the Comanche on the southern plains, the overwhelmingly likely reason was business. They ran the largest commercial network on that half of the continent. Horses, hides, mules, guns, dried meat, information, and people. Their language became the working tongue of the southern plains. If you wanted to trade out there, you learned Comanche. The Spanish traded with them. The French traded with them. The Americans traded with them. Whole New Mexican villages made their living inside a Comanche economy. And for roughly a century and a half, they were not the ones being pushed. Spain could not expand north past them. That is not an opinion. It is a line on a map that stopped moving for 100 years. France could not get through them. Mexico inherited the problem and could not solve it either. 3 empires, 1 people with no cities at all. Which brings us to the thing nobody has fully explained. There was no Comanche capital, no king, no central government, no written records of any kind, no bureaucracy, no tax collection, no throne to take. There were bands, dozens of them, making their own decisions, splitting apart, recombining, sometimes disagreeing with each other violently. There was nobody you could conquer to make it stop. That was the entire problem. A general could march north, win a battle, burn a camp, and find he had defeated one band out of many, and that nothing at all had changed. Historians today still argue about what to even call this. Some now use the word empire. Others think that word drags in European assumptions that do not fit, and that we reach for it only because we have nothing better. That argument is live, in print, between serious people, right now. We're not going to settle it tonight, but we are going to go and stand on that ground. What you would have seen, what you would have heard first, what the rules were, and there were rules, and breaking them got people killed. What happened at the trade fairs, and what happened when the trading stopped. If sleep is what you came for, this was built for that, and you will not miss anything by drifting off part way. Down in the comments, tell me where you're sitting or lying right now, and what your clock says. It is a good thing to picture. Somebody in Kansas City with a house gone quiet at last. Somebody in Copenhagen with rain coming at the window sideways. Somebody in Brisbane with the afternoon stretching out gold. Different clocks, the same open grass. Every one of them gets read. Now for some corrections, since this is one of the most badly misrepresented peoples in American history, and almost everything you have absorbed about them arrived through a screen. They were not nomads wandering aimlessly. That word gets used constantly and it is close to meaningless here. They moved on a schedule, along known routes to known places for known reasons. Grass, water, game, trade. It was a logistics system, not drifting. They were not one tribe with one chief. There were multiple large divisions and many bands inside them, and each one made its own decisions. A leader led because people chose to follow him this season. If they stopped agreeing with him, they left. That is not disorganization. It is a completely different theory of authority, and it turned out to be almost impossible to defeat. They did not live in a timeless ancient way. The Comanche world as it existed at its height was, historically speaking, brand new. It was built in the 18th century, out of an animal that had arrived from Europe. It lasted around 150 years. It was in the sweep of things a startlingly modern civilization that grew and peaked and collapsed inside the same span as the United States, going from 13 colonies to a transcontinental republic. And they were not primarily raiders. Raiding existed, and we're not going to pretend otherwise. But raiding was one instrument in a large economy, and treating it as the whole picture is like describing a nation by its army, and never mentioning that it had ports. So here is the road ahead of us. We begin in the mountains with a small group on foot who have never seen a horse. We will watch the horses arrive, and we'll look closely at what that actually does to a society, because it is far stranger and more total than they got faster. Then we will go out onto the southern plains and stand where you would have stood. We will see what you would have seen first on the horizon. We will learn the rules of approach and what happened to people who got them wrong. We will walk into the trade fairs at Taos and Pecos, where Spanish colonists and Comanche traders did business under a truce that everyone understood and nobody wrote down. We will look honestly at the hardest parts, including the ones that do not flatter anybody. We will watch Spain give up and sign, and then we will sit with the question that historians still cannot close. How do you build a power with no capital, no king, no writing, and no army, and hold 3 empires off for a century and a half? Let us start before the horse. In the 1600s, the people who had become the Comanche were living in the mountains and high basins of what is now Wyoming, and there was nothing about them that would have made you look twice. They were closely related to the Shoshone, same language family, same broad way of life, and for a long time no meaningful distinction between them at all. They hunted, they gathered, they moved with the seasons between elevations, following what was edible, and they walked. I want to slow down on that word because we say it too easily and it hides an enormous amount. Walking meant that everything you owned had to be carried by a person or dragged by a dog. Dogs were the transport technology, hauling small loads on frames of poles. A good dog could manage maybe 30 or 40 pounds. That is your ceiling. That is the size of your house, your food store, your entire material world. So your shelter is small because you have to carry it. Your food surplus is small because you have to carry that too. Your possessions are almost nothing because every object has to justify its weight against your own back. Walking also set the size of your world. A group on foot with children and elders covers maybe 8 or 10 miles in a day of travel, and that is with effort. So your knowledge of the world is a circle a few days wide, and everything beyond it is rumour. And it set your relationship with the bison. The great herds were out on the plains east of the mountains, and they were the largest concentration of protein on the continent. Everyone knew they were there. Getting at them on foot was another matter entirely. You could do it. People had done it for thousands of years, with tremendous skill and tremendous risk. Driving animals into arroyos, over cliffs, into snowdrifts, working in large coordinated groups, taking whatever you could and processing it fast before it spoiled, and hoping the whole enterprise did not end with somebody trampled. But you could not follow the herds. A bison herd moves. It moves faster and further than people carrying their belongings on their backs. So the relationship was opportunistic. You took what came near, and the rest of the time you ate what the mountains gave you. That was the ceiling on that entire world. Not intelligence, not courage, not organization, carrying capacity and speed. Everything that happens next in this story is what occurs when that ceiling is removed in a single generation. And it did not come from an invention. It came walking north through the grass, traded hand to hand, and the people who eventually rode it better than anyone on earth did not build it, discover it, or breed it. They received it, traded in, hand to hand from the north, arriving out of an empire that had just been thrown out of its own colony 400 miles to the south, and that had spent 80 years passing laws designed specifically to prevent this exact thing from happening. To understand how the Comanche got horses, you have to look at a rebellion 400 miles to the south. The Spanish had been in New Mexico since the end of the 1500s. They had brought priests, soldiers, colonists, disease, forced labour, and a demand that the Pueblo peoples abandon their own ceremonies. For 80 years the pressure built. In August 1680, the Pueblo nations rose together. It was coordinated across dozens of communities speaking several different languages, timed by knotted cords carried by runners so that everyone moved on the same day. It is one of the most successful indigenous uprisings in the history of the Americas, and most people outside the Southwest have never heard of it. The Spanish were driven completely out. They abandoned Santa Fe. Survivors retreated hundreds of miles south to the El Paso area and stayed out for 12 years. And when they went, they left the horses, not a handful. Herds, the accumulated breeding stock of 80 years of colonial ranching, suddenly ownerless on a continent where no European authority existed to control them. Now, the Spanish had a law against this. They had always understood that mounted native nations would be a catastrophe for colonial control, and it was formally forbidden to teach native people to ride or to let them own horses. The law was not perfectly enforced. You cannot run a ranch without hands, but it existed, and its purpose was exactly this. In 1680, that law stopped mattering permanently. Horses moved north out of New Mexico along trade routes that had been carrying goods across the plains and mountains for centuries. Routes the Spanish did not control and largely did not know about. They passed from the Pueblos to the Apache, from the Apache onward, north through the Rockies, group to group, each one learning from the last. And around the very start of the 1700s, they reached the Shoshone country in the north. We can put a marker on the other end of this. The name Comanche first appears in Spanish records out of New Mexico in 1706, a report that a new people had come down from the north and were dangerous. So, horses arrive at the top of the map, and within a few years a new nation is being reported at the bottom of it. That is not a coincidence. That is cause and effect, and the effect is one of the fastest social transformations recorded anywhere. But why it was so total is the interesting part, and it is not the reason most people assume. The obvious answer is speed, and the obvious answer is the least important one. Here is what a horse really does to a society that has been walking. It multiplies what you can carry by roughly 10. A dog hauls 30 or 40 pounds. A horse hauls 300 or 400 and can pull a great deal more on a frame behind it. Overnight, every physical constraint on your life loosens at once. Your shelter can be bigger, so the teepee grows from a cramped structure a few people can drag to a large, warm, engineered cone with long lodge poles that a horse carries easily. Your food store can be bigger, which means you can survive a bad month instead of starving in it. You can own things: robes, tools, ceremonial items, spare weapons, extra clothing, objects that were unthinkable when every ounce came off your own back. It multiplies your range by 5 or 6. A group on foot moves 8 or 10 miles. A mounted group with horses to spare moves 40, 50, and in a hard push far beyond that. Your world stops being a circle a few days across and becomes a territory the size of a European country. Which means you can now do something that was impossible before. You can follow the bison. That single change reorganizes everything. You're no longer waiting for the herds to come near you. You're living alongside them, moving as they move, taking what you need through the year instead of gambling everything on a few chances. And it turns wealth into something that reproduces. This is the part that gets missed, and it may matter most. Before horses, wealth was food and objects, and both are perishable. Horses are not. Horses are capital. They breed. A man with 40 horses this year may have 50 next year without doing anything except keeping them alive. So for the first time there is accumulation. There is inequality. There is inheritance. There is something to lend, to gift, to demand as a price, to build alliances with, and crucially, something to take from someone else. An entire economy comes into existence, and it has a currency that walks. And there is one more thing, the strangest of them. A person on a horse is not a faster person. In combat, in negotiation, in the raw physics of it, a mounted man and a man on foot are not the same species of problem. Height, mass, momentum, the ability to withdraw at will and return at a time of your choosing, the entire relationship between the two is asymmetric. For about 150 years on the southern plains, the Comanche were almost always the mounted party in that equation. Now, every group that received horses in this period got the same benefits. The Apache had horses, the Ute, the Kiowa, the Cheyenne, the Sioux, the Blackfeet, all of them. Horses spread across the entire West. So why the Comanche? Why is it this particular group that turns into the dominant power of the southern plains, rather than any of the dozen others holding the same technology? That question does not have a clean answer either, and honest historians will tell you so. But a large part of it comes down to something you can watch happening in a Comanche camp on any ordinary morning. They did not treat the horse as transport. They rebuilt the human body around it. Start with the children. Comanche infants were on horseback before they could reliably walk, carried in cradle boards secured to a saddle, then held in front of an adult, so that the motion of a horse was one of the first physical facts of their existence. Not a novelty, background. By 4 or 5 they had their own animals and were riding independently. By the time a boy was 10 he was expected to be genuinely capable, and by his mid-teens he was doing things that professional European cavalry considered specialist skills. Understand what that produces. This is not training. Training is what you do to an adult who already has a body organized around walking. This is development, a nervous system that grows up with a horse underneath it, the way yours grew up with a floor. Balance on a moving animal is not a skill they learned. It is closer to a sense they had, and that distinction shows up in the strangest places. European observers kept remarking that Comanche riders did not appear to be doing anything. There was no visible effort, no bracing, no working of the reins. The horse turned and the rider turned with it, as if the two were a single object that happened to have 2 heads, which is exactly what you would expect from a person whose inner ear finished forming while a horse was moving underneath it. And the equipment matched the philosophy. Comanche saddles were minimal, light frames or often nothing at all beyond a pad. Stirrups were short or absent. Bridles were simple. There was very little apparatus between the rider and the animal, because apparatus is what you need when you cannot feel what the horse is doing. Which brings us back to the manoeuvre Catlin watched in 1834. The loop over the horse's neck, a short strap of hide or hair, sometimes braided into the mane, is one of the great pieces of engineering minimalism anywhere in the history of warfare. You hook a heel or an elbow into it, drop your weight down the far side of the animal, and now you're travelling at 30 miles an hour with several 100 pounds of horse between you and whoever is shooting. You can stay there. You can shoot from there, arm up under the neck, you can come back up, cross to the other side and do it again. The horse, meanwhile, is being steered by knee pressure and body weight, because both of your hands are busy. And now put a number on it that turns this from impressive into decisive. A soldier with a muzzle-loading firearm in this period needed roughly 20 seconds to reload. Bite the cartridge, pour the powder, seat the ball, draw the ramrod, ram it home, replace the ramrod, prime, cock, aim, fire. 20 seconds if he is well drilled and calm, and men are rarely calm. In 20 seconds, a Comanche archer at close range could put a lot of arrows in the air. Not 2 or 3, a great many. So the encounter looks like this. The man on foot gets one shot, and if he misses, he's now a man holding an empty tube while a rider closes on him at speed from an angle he cannot easily face. And it is worse than that, because the arrow had one advantage nobody expected. It was quiet. A rifle announces itself. The sound tells everyone within a mile where you are and that you're now defenseless for 20 seconds. A bow tells nobody anything. There is a reason that experienced frontier fighters, men who could afford whatever weapon they wanted, wrote with real respect about the bow well into the 19th century. It was not nostalgia. At close range from a moving horse against a man with a single-shot weapon, it was simply the better tool. For about 130 years that arithmetic held. It only broke when firearms changed, when the repeating revolver arrived and one man could suddenly fire 6 times without stopping. That single technology did more to end Comanche dominance than any general did. But we're getting ahead. In 1750, none of that exists. In 1750, the Comanche have horses, they have the best riders alive, and they have decided to go south. They did not stay in the mountains. Through the first half of the 1700s, the Comanche moved steadily south and east, out of the Wyoming and Colorado high country, and down onto the southern plains, into what is now Kansas, Oklahoma, eastern New Mexico, and most of all Texas. They were moving toward the bison. The southern herds were enormous and the grass was better, and with horses those herds were now reachable in a way they had never been. But that country was not empty. It belonged to the Apache. The Apache were formidable and they were not new to any of this. What followed was a long, grinding, decades-long displacement, and by the middle of the century the Comanche had pushed the Apache off the southern plains almost entirely, driving them west and south into the deserts and mountains. I am going to be brief about the fighting, and I want to tell you why, rather than just skip it. It is not squeamishness. It is that dwelling on it distorts the picture in exactly the way this whole video is trying to correct. This was a war between two powerful nations over the best hunting territory on the continent, and it was resolved the way such wars usually are. What matters for our purposes is the outcome, and the outcome is a map. And it was not one people moving as one body. That matters, and it is worth putting down clearly now because it explains almost everything that follows. There were several large divisions, and inside them many bands, and they had their own names, their own country, their own preferences, and their own quarrels. The Spanish and later the Americans learned these names slowly and often got them wrong. The Penatica in the south, toward the Texas hill country, the Kotsoteca out on the Buffalo Range, the Yamparica in the north, the Noconi, the Wanderers, and out in the high, dry country of the Llano Estacado, the Quahadi, the most remote of all of them, the ones who came in last. Each of these could act on its own. Each could make peace on its own. Each could be at war while another was trading. Understand that, and you understand why every European power that dealt with them ended up furious and confused. By around 1750, the Comanche controlled a territory that the Spanish began to call Comancheria. It was vast. Depending on the decade and how you draw the edges, somewhere on the order of 250,000 square miles, larger than most European countries, larger than the entirety of Spain's effective settlement in New Mexico and Texas combined. And here is the detail that tells you what kind of power this was. There was no border, no line, no wall, no chain of forts, no garrisons. Comancheria was not defined by defended edges. It was defined by presence, by the fact that anyone attempting to operate inside it without Comanche consent would sooner or later be reminded that they were doing so. The Spanish had a word for their own frontier, presidio, a fortified post, garrisoned, permanent, expensive, on a map. That is how empires with capitals mark territory. Comancheria had none of that and worked better. Which is the first hint of the thing we cannot fully explain, because in every model we have of how power works, that should not be possible. Now let us go out into it. So, you're on the southern plains in, let us say, 1800. Maybe you're a Spanish trader out of Santa Fe with mules and goods. Maybe you're a New Mexican villager who's done this run before. Maybe you're an American a long way from anywhere. It does not matter much. What follows is roughly the same. The first thing to understand is the country itself, because it does something to human perception that people who have not stood in it consistently underestimate. It is flat, and it is enormous, and the sky takes up a proportion of your visual field that feels wrong. People arriving from wooded country often describe something close to vertigo in the first days. Not fear of the open, something more mechanical than that. Your eyes are built to measure distance against things. Trees, buildings, hills, a line of fence. Take all of that away and the measuring stops working. You're looking at 10 miles and your brain refuses to commit to a number. There are no trees except along the watercourses. The grass runs to the horizon in every direction and moves constantly in the wind, so the whole landscape has a slow, shifting motion to it. There is very little to fix your eye on. Distance is almost impossible to judge. A dark shape on the horizon could be a mile away or 5. Heat shimmer makes things float and stretch. Objects appear to be moving when they are not. Sound behaves oddly out there too. On flat ground with a steady wind there is nothing for noise to bounce off, so it arrives thin and directionless. You can hear something clearly and be unable to say where it is. A trader who had done that run 20 times learned to distrust his own senses and read the ground instead. Tracks, dung, cropped grass, which way the water ran. Which means the first thing you notice is usually not a shape at all. It is dust, a thin brown smear standing up off the horizon in a place where there is no reason for one, holding its shape too long to be a dust devil. Then, after a while, the smear resolves, and what you see is not a war party, almost never. What you see is a community in motion, and it is far larger and far stranger than you expected. Hundreds of horses, that is the first shock. Not a horse per person. Herds, moving loose, driven by boys on the flanks. A Comanche band on the move might be travelling with several times more horses than people. Wealthy men owned them in the hundreds. The nation may have held 100,000 animals or more. Behind and among them, the travois. Long lodge poles lashed to a horse's shoulders, trailing on the ground with hides, bundles, children and elderly people riding on the frames. Dogs everywhere. Women mounted and directing. The whole column stretched out for a considerable distance. It is not silent. Horses, dogs, children, poles dragging tack, voices carrying oddly on flat ground. And you are watching perhaps 1,000 horses and several hundred people cross a landscape with no roads on it, in good order, and you have absolutely no idea whether the next few minutes are going to be commercial or fatal. Which is when your knowledge of the rules becomes the most valuable thing you own. There were rules. That is the thing nobody tells you, not written anywhere, not codified, but absolutely real, understood by everybody who did business on those plains, and violating them had consequences that arrived quickly. Rule 1. You do not approach, you are approached. Riding toward a Comanche band uninvited is the single fastest way to be misread. You stop. You make yourself visible in open ground. You wait, and you may wait a long time, and the waiting is itself part of the message. I am not attempting to surprise anybody. Riders will come out to look at you, usually a small number, usually staying at a distance for a while, circling, taking their time. You do not move during this. Everything about you is being read. How many, what you're carrying, whether your goods are trade goods, whether your posture is that of someone who expects to leave. Rule 2. Your hands. Weapons visible but not held. Nothing sudden. Do not dismount unless you are invited to, and do not reach into a pack without first showing what your hand is going to come back out with. And if you know the sign language, and any competent plains trader did, you use it. Plains Indian Sign Language is one of the underrated achievements of the continent, a full gestural language that worked between people with no spoken tongue in common, across dozens of nations and enormous distances. A Spanish trader and a Comanche headman with no shared words could negotiate quantities, prices, routes, and grievances entirely with their hands, and both would come away with the same understanding of what had been agreed. Rule 3. You bring gifts, and you understand what a gift is. This is where Europeans went wrong more than anywhere else, and it is worth getting right, because it explains 150 years of misunderstanding. In the European frame, you give a present, the other party is pleased, and the transaction is complete. Debt discharged. That is not what is happening here. Gift exchange on the plains was relationship infrastructure. Giving created an ongoing obligation in both directions. Receiving obliged you. Reciprocating obliged them. The exchange was not the end of anything. It was the establishment of a channel between two parties that would need to be maintained, renewed, and fed. Spanish and later American officials repeatedly treated annual gifts as a nuisance or a bribe, and then were baffled and outraged when relations collapsed after they stopped giving them. But from the other side, nothing confusing had happened at all. The relationship had been allowed to lapse. A channel that is not fed closes. That is how it works. Nobody had betrayed anybody. One party had simply stopped participating in the thing that made peace exist. Rule 4. Know who you are talking to. This is the one that broke European diplomacy again and again, and it goes to the heart of the whole story. You're not dealing with the Comanche. You are dealing with this band. Its leaders speak for the people currently choosing to follow them, and no further. A leader from another division 150 miles away has not agreed to anything and is not bound by anything. Spain never fully absorbed this. Officials would negotiate a treaty, congratulate themselves, and then be astonished when a different band operated as if no treaty existed. From the Spanish perspective, this proved bad faith. From the Comanche perspective, nothing had been broken, because a person cannot break an agreement he never made. Rule 5, and it is the one people forget. The truce was real. This is the thing that surprises people most. Bands that had been in open conflict with the Spanish province would come to the trade fairs at Taos or Pecos and trade peacefully under a recognized truce with the same colonists. And then the truce would end and things would resume. That is not hypocrisy and it is not chaos. It is a functioning distinction between trade time and other time, understood and observed by both sides, holding for decades. Everybody knew when the fair was on. Everybody knew what the rules were inside it, and it survived because it paid everybody. That is the unromantic engine underneath the whole arrangement. The colonists at Taos needed horses and hides and meat. The bands needed maize and metal and cloth. Neither side had a realistic alternative supplier, and both understood that burning the arrangement down would cost them more than it cost the other. Peace on that frontier was not friendship, and it was not virtue. It was two parties who had run the numbers, so let us go to one. Picture Taos in late summer, a small adobe town at the north end of Spanish New Mexico, in the mountains, at the edge of the empire's reach. For most of the year it is a quiet, poor, dusty place, and Madrid barely knows it exists. And then the fair comes, and it becomes for a few weeks one of the most important commercial locations in North America. Comanche bands come in from the plains with horses, mules, hides, dried meat and tallow. Ute traders come down from the north. Apache come. Pueblo traders are there. Spanish colonists come up from the river settlements with what the plains cannot make. The colonial governor sends an official presence, partly to tax and partly to keep order, and everyone, including the governor, understands that the fair happens on terms the Comanche are content with, not on Spanish terms. What is actually changing hands? From the plains, horses and mules above everything else. Comancheria was the horse reservoir of the southern half of the continent, and horses moved out of it in enormous numbers in every direction for a century and a half. Also bison robes, the winter hides, thick and dressed and hugely valuable in the East, dried meat, rendered fat which sounds unglamorous, and was a genuine staple commodity. From the settlements, maize and flour, which mattered enormously. A meat economy needs carbohydrate, and the plains do not grow much. Metal, knives, awls, axes, arrowheads, pots, cloth, tobacco, sugar, beads and vermilion, and guns and powder, which everyone officially prohibited and everyone actually traded. Because if the Spanish would not supply them, the French would, and later the Americans would, and each of them knew it. That last point is one of the most important facts in this entire story, and it explains why the Comanche were never simply outsupplied. They played the empires against each other, deliberately and expertly for 100 years. And to do that you have to know things. You have to know that Spain and France are rivals. You have to know when a war in Europe has changed who holds Louisiana. You have to know that the Americans pushing out of Missouri answer to a different government than the ones in Texas. All of that arrived by word of mouth, carried across the plains by traders and travellers and captives and returning parties, and it was accurate enough to act on for a century. There was an intelligence network out there. It had no offices and left no files. Spanish rule said no guns to native nations, so the Comanche traded with French merchants coming west out of Louisiana, who were delighted to arm anybody who inconvenienced Spain. When Louisiana changed hands, they traded with whoever now held it, then with American traders pushing out of Missouri and Arkansas. There were always at least 2 European powers on that continent who wanted the same thing, and there was always a Comanche band willing to talk to the one offering better terms. This was not luck. It was policy, executed consistently across generations by a people who understood the political map of the Atlantic world well enough to profit from it. Now picture the fair from inside it, because there is a detail here that reorganizes how you should picture all of this. The trading is being conducted by both men and women, and a great deal of the value being exchanged was produced by women. Because the bison robe, the single most valuable export of the southern plains, is not made by killing a bison. It is made by processing one, and processing is where the labor actually lives. A hide has to be staked out, fleshed, scraped, treated, worked soft over days. It is heavy, skilled, exhausting work, done kneeling, outdoors, in whatever weather there is, on a skin that weighs more than a person when it is wet. One hunter could kill far more animals than his household could process, and the limit on a family's wealth was not how many bison a man could bring down. It was how many hides his household could turn into trade goods. That economic reality shaped Comanche society profoundly, including in ways that were hard on the women doing the work, and any honest account has to say so. Which brings us to the section of this story I have been putting off. I'm going to handle this carefully and briefly, and then we're going to move on. But leaving it out would make everything else dishonest, and honesty is the whole point of this channel. The Comanche took captives. So did the Apache. So did the Ute, the Kiowa, and the Pawnee. So did the Spanish, who took native captives and held them in colonial households under a system everyone involved understood perfectly well regardless of what it was called. So did the Mexicans. So, later, did the Americans. Captive-taking was not a Comanche peculiarity. It was a feature of that entire borderland for 2 centuries, running in every direction, and every party in it participated. Within the Comanche system, captives could face very different outcomes. Some were traded onward, some were held in servitude, and some, this is the part that Europeans found most difficult to understand, were adopted fully, given family, name, standing, and a permanent place, and became Comanche in every sense the society recognized. That is not a softening of the picture. It sits alongside the harder parts rather than replacing them. But it is documented, it was common, and it produced situations that broke the categories completely. Children taken young who grew up entirely inside Comanche life, and who, when their birth families finally located them years later, did not want to leave. That happened repeatedly. It is one of the most consistently reported and least discussed features of the whole borderland, and it tells you something about how completely a person could be absorbed. I am not going to dwell here, and I am not going to give you distressing detail because that is not what this channel is for, and it is not what you came for at 1 in the morning. What matters for the story is the economic point. Captives were part of the exchange system of the Southern Plains, and the Southern Plains exchange system was Comanche-dominated. Now let us get back to the grass, because there is something underneath all of this that we have not looked at properly yet, and without it, none of it works. Everything you have heard tonight rests on the bison, and I do not think most people appreciate how completely. Start with the scale. The southern herds were, in the 18th century, among the largest concentrations of large mammals on Earth, not a resource, an ecosystem, moving. Now understand what a bison actually was to a plains household. Not dinner, infrastructure. The meat, obviously, fresh, and dried into thin sheets that kept for months, and pounded together with fat and berries into the dense preserved food that would keep a person alive through a winter or a long ride. But then, the hide became lodge covers, robes, blankets, clothing, containers, ropes, and the shields that could actually stop an arrow. Sinew became thread and bowstring, horn became spoons and cups, bone became tools, scrapers, awls, and the frames of things. The stomach and bladder became vessels for carrying water. The hooves could be rendered into glue. The tail became a fly whisk. Dried dung was the fuel on a plain with almost no wood, and it burns cleanly and hot, which is why anyone could cook out there at all. There is almost nothing on that animal that did not have a use, and the reason is not reverence for its own sake. It is that on the open plains there was nothing else. Think about what you would actually have out there if you removed the bison. Grass, some cottonwood along the creeks if you are near a creek, a few edible roots and fruits in season, small game. That is close to the entire list. Every hard material a household needed, every rope, every container, every blade handle, every roof, had to come off an animal, be traded in from somewhere else, or simply not exist. No forest, very little stone. Bison were the raw material supply of an entire civilization, and they walk to you. Now put the horse back into it. Horses let you follow the herds. Horses let you kill from close range at speed, which changes hunting from a mass coordination problem into something a small group can do reliably in an afternoon. Horses let you carry the results away. Bison plus horse is the whole engine. Take either one out and the entire structure comes down. Hold on to that sentence. It is going to come back at the end of tonight, and when it does, it will not be a metaphor. But there is a second layer to this that goes past food entirely. The horse herds themselves had to eat, and horses eat grass, and grass is not infinite. A band travelling with several thousand animals is moving a genuinely enormous appetite across the landscape. You cannot stay anywhere long. You must know where the grass will be, and the water, in every season, across a territory the size of a European country, and you must move before you exhaust a place rather than after. So the movement everyone dismisses as wandering is nothing of the kind. It is a continuous logistics operation with no margin for error, run without maps or writing, on knowledge held in memory and passed down verbally. Get it wrong and your horses weaken. Weak horses mean you cannot hunt, cannot trade, cannot travel, and cannot defend yourself. Everything is downstream of the grass, and this is where the seasonal calendar comes in, because it was not improvised. Winter meant getting down into sheltered ground. The canyon systems cut into the plains, where the walls broke the wind and there was cottonwood and water and grass that had not been grazed since spring. Palo Duro, out in the Texas Panhandle, is the most famous of them, a gash hundreds of feet deep in otherwise featureless country, invisible until you're almost on the edge of it. Summer meant back up onto the open plains with the herds spread out, moving constantly. A band that got that calendar wrong, that stayed too long, or came down too late, or chose a canyon somebody else had already grazed out, did not have a bad season. It had a crisis, which is worth remembering when you get to the part where it ends, because when the end came, it did not come from an army. By the 1770s, the Spanish position on the northern frontier was untenable, and everyone in Madrid knew it. New Mexico was a poor, distant province that cost more to defend than it produced. Texas was worse. The Spanish presence there was a handful of missions and presidios strung out across a landscape they did not control in any meaningful sense. They had tried the military solution for decades. Punitive expeditions marched out, sometimes won engagements, burned camps, and came home having accomplished nothing structural, because the war did not have a centre, and there was nobody whose defeat ended it. They had tried alliances with other nations. That worked in fragments, and failed as a system, and the cost never stopped. Every year, more soldiers, more supply, more expense, for a frontier that did not move. So in the 1780s, Spain did something remarkable, and it is one of the clearest windows in the whole story into who actually held the balance of power. They changed policy from conquest to diplomacy, and they paid. The architect on the ground was Juan Bautista de Anza, governor of New Mexico, an experienced and genuinely capable frontier soldier. And on the Comanche side, the principal figure in the negotiations was a leader the Spanish recorded as Equeracapa. What made agreement possible in 1786 was that the Comanche side had done something difficult. Enough of the Western bands had coordinated to give a negotiator standing to speak for a large portion of them. That was not the normal condition of Comanche politics, and it took real work. The terms are the interesting part. Peace, open trade at fixed locations, Spanish recognition of Comanche standing, and, critically, regular gifts from Spain to the Comanche, delivered on a schedule. Spain called them gifts. Read them however you like. An empire with a king and a navy and silver mines was making scheduled payments to a people with no capital city in exchange for being left alone. And the treaty largely held for decades, which is more than can be said for most agreements on that frontier. It held because it was built on how Comanche relationships actually worked: continuous, reciprocal, fed, rather than on the European idea of a document that settles a matter permanently. And it is worth pausing on how strange that document is when you hold it up against the century around it. This is the same era in which European powers were partitioning continents on paper, drawing lines through places they had never visited, and assigning ownership of other people's countries by treaty among themselves. Spain in particular had a long and comfortable habit of declaring sovereignty over enormous regions on the strength of a landing and a flag. And here, on its own northern frontier, that same empire sat down and negotiated as one party among two, and then paid. There is no clearer measure of who held what. Empires do not schedule payments to people they can simply take from. Then Spain lost its empire, and Mexico inherited the frontier, and Mexico could not afford the gifts. The channel was not fed, so it closed. And the following decades were violent in a way the 1786 arrangement had prevented for a generation, and the reason was, at bottom, an accounting decision made a very long way away. Which leaves the question we've been circling all night. Let us take it seriously as a military and political problem, the way the people facing it had to. You're a Spanish, and then Mexican, and then American commander. You have been told to end the Comanche problem. What do you actually do? You cannot take their capital because there isn't one. No city, no fortress, no seat of government, nothing whose capture would mean anything. You cannot capture their leadership because it isn't a hierarchy. Take a leader, and the people who followed him choose another, or disperse into other bands, or simply carry on. There is no head to the organization because the organization is not shaped like that. You cannot destroy their economy because it walks and you cannot see it. No warehouses, no fields, no granaries, no infrastructure to burn. The wealth is horses and hides, and both are mobile, and both are somewhere else by the time you arrive. You cannot force a decisive battle because they will not give you one. Why would they? They can withdraw at will and return at a time that suits them. A commander needs an enemy that stands and fights. They had no reason to and did not. You cannot outrun them. Your cavalry moves at the pace of its slowest element and its supply train. They move faster over longer distances on relays of spare mounts. You cannot outsupply them because when you cut off their trade, another empire is right there offering better terms, and they know it before you do. And you cannot even find them reliably. 250,000 square miles, no roads, no fixed settlements, and every advantage of local knowledge on their side. There is a psychological dimension to this that the reports keep circling without naming. Campaigning into Comancheria meant months in country, where the other side always knew where you were and you never knew where they were. Your scouts came back with nothing. Your horses got thin. Your men got sick. And out in that grass somewhere a decision was being taken about whether you were worth the trouble, and it was not your decision to make. Officers wrote home about the exhaustion of that far more often than they wrote about fighting. Every tool a state has for defeating a rival requires the rival to be shaped roughly like a state. Comancheria was not shaped like anything Europeans had a category for. And that, far more than any tactical brilliance, is why it lasted 150 years. Which brings us at last to the thing that is genuinely unresolved. And I want to do it properly because it is more interesting than a simple answer would be. Here is the question that historians are actually fighting about, and it is not, were the Comanche powerful? That is settled. The maps settle it. The question is, what was it? Because look at what we have. A political entity with no capital, no monarch, no bureaucracy, no writing, no standing army, no taxation, no fixed borders and no permanent structures, which nevertheless controlled 250,000 square miles, dictated terms to European empires, ran the dominant economy of half a continent, and lasted longer than a great many recognized states. Every single instrument we normally use to identify a power is absent. So in 2008, the historian Pekka Hämäläinen published a book arguing that we should stop treating this as a special case and simply call it what it functionally was, an empire. His argument was that on the southern plains, the ordinary direction of colonial history was reversed, that Europeans were the ones being drawn into someone else's economic and political system on that system's terms. The book was enormously influential and won major prizes, and it was and remains contested. The objections are serious. Some historians argue that empire imports a whole set of European assumptions: centralized authority, subject populations, extraction, administration, and that applying it here tells you more about the limits of our vocabulary than about the Comanche. Others argue the model overstates how coordinated the bands actually were, and that describing a fluid, decentralized, kin-based political world as an empire flattens exactly what made it distinctive. Others still think the framework underplays the experience of the peoples who lived under Comanche dominance rather than alongside it. That debate is live right now, not a mystery for lack of evidence, a genuine disagreement among people who have all read the same documents about what those documents mean. And I find that more interesting than a tidy answer, because of what it reveals. We have a word for the Spanish system. We have words for the French and British and American systems. They fit because those systems generated the vocabulary in the first place. We do not have a word that fits the Comanche system, and we have been reaching for the nearest one for 200 years. For most of that time, the nearest one was raiders, which is how something this large stayed almost invisible in the general story of the American West until embarrassingly recently. Not because it was hidden, but because it did not look like the shape we were looking for. Hold that thought. We are nearly at the end, and it is going to come back. Here is the part that surprises people most, and it is the reason I asked you to hold on to that sentence about the engine. They were not defeated in war. There is no great battle where the Comanche are broken. There is no campaign that shattered them. If you go looking for the decisive military moment, you will not find one because it does not exist. What happened was three things arriving close together, and none of them was an army. The first was disease. Epidemics moved through the plains repeatedly across the 1700s and 1800s. Smallpox above all, and then in 1849, cholera. The 1849 cholera epidemic came up the trails with the traffic heading for the California gold fields, and it went through the southern plains catastrophically. We do not have reliable numbers, and honest historians say so. Population estimates for the Comanche at their height range enormously, and the death tolls are estimates built on estimates. But every account agrees it was devastating on a scale that reorganized the entire society. You cannot maintain a continental power while burying that proportion of your people. And crucially, disease does not respect any of the structural advantages we have spent the night describing. Decentralization does not help. Mobility does not help. Being unconquerable does not help at all. The second was the grass. This one gets almost no attention and may have mattered as much as anything. Through the middle of the 19th century, the southern plains went through a severe extended drought. At the same time, the corridors across the plains were filling with traffic, wagon trains, cattle, and the animals of everyone heading west, all eating the same grass along the same watercourses. Remember the logistics operation. Remember that everything is downstream of the grass. Weakened grass means weakened horses, and weakened horses degrade every single Comanche advantage simultaneously: hunting, trade, mobility, defense. And the third was the bison. In the 1870s, commercial hide hunting arrived on the southern plains, with railroads to move the product, and a tanning process that made bison leather industrially valuable. What followed was one of the fastest destructions of a large animal population in recorded history. The southern herd, millions of animals, was reduced to near nothing in a handful of years, not by Comanche hunting, by commercial operations shipping hides east by rail. And now go back to the sentence I asked you to keep. Bison plus horse is the whole engine. Take either one out and the structure comes down. The bison went. And that was the end, and it did not require a single battle to be won. Some of the American officers involved understood this perfectly and said so out loud, that destroying the herds would accomplish what campaigns had not. It was not a secret, and it was not an accident. By 1875, the last free Comanche band on the plains had nowhere left to feed itself. They came into Fort Sill in Indian Territory not because they had been beaten in the field, but because the country that had made them possible no longer contained enough to live on. 150 years from the arrival of an animal to the disappearance of another one. I want to be careful about how this ends, because there is a way of telling this story that is quietly false, and it is the way it usually gets told. The false version puts a full stop after 1875. The Plains Empire ends, the buffalo go, the sun sets, and the people become a chapter that closed. That is not what happened. The Comanche Nation exists. It is headquartered in Lawton, Oklahoma. It is a federally recognized sovereign nation with its own government, its own courts, its own enterprises, and its own citizens numbering in the tens of thousands. The language is still spoken, though the number of fluent first language speakers became very small, and there has been serious sustained work to bring it back. Recordings, dictionaries, classes, young people learning the language of their great-grandparents deliberately. And there is a piece of this that most people have heard without knowing what they were hearing. In the Second World War, Comanche speakers served as code talkers with American forces in Europe, transmitting messages in a language that no adversary could break, the same language that the schools of an earlier generation had punished children for speaking. The last leader of the last free band, Quanah Parker, did not vanish either. He spent his remaining decades doing something almost nobody predicted: negotiating, leasing grazing land, arguing with Washington, building a house, and becoming a figure that the country he had fought found it could not simply file away. He hunted with a sitting American president. He's buried in Oklahoma. So no full stop. A change of shape. If you were good company out there tonight, a like takes no time at all, and it is honestly most of how something told this slowly ever gets in front of anybody. Subscribe and the next one will turn up on its own. Another country, another century, another people who turn out to be a great deal more than the one sentence we inherited about them. And leave a note below with your town, and whatever hour it happens to be where you're sitting, everyone gets read. Now put it down. The horses are unsaddled. The fire is banked. There is nothing left to cross tonight. Good night.